My name is Julie Farnam, and I am the author of the book Domestic Darkness. And it tells my story of January 6th and also some of the groups that were involved with that day.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. The book is excellent and gives us some real insight on the inner workings of the Capitol Police. Could you tell us what your role was prior to and how you came to that role?
Sure. So I worked for the Department of Homeland Security for a little over 15 years, most of that time with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. My last job there, I was in charge of immigration vetting. So I oversaw their intelligence watch at USCIS and also all the immigration cases that had national security issues. So we did the classified vetting of those cases. But USCIS is self-funded, and between the pandemic and some restrictive, immigration policies, they were furloughing a lot of employees. So I made the jump and went over to the Capitol Police. And I started at the Capitol Police in October 2020. So if there's one thing I'm very good at, it's bad timing. Because that was probably like the worst timing to go to the Capitol. So I was on the job 72 days when January 6th happened. I was hired as the Assistant Director of Intelligence for the Capitol Police. I eventually acted as the director for a little over a year. During my time there, I was there for about 3 years. And it was quite a ride.
Yeah, I mean, yes, the book details a lot of that, a lot of the momentum that happened. So could you tell us what your role was as assistant director, and then kind of leading up to January 6th, you were involved in some of the intelligence collection and overseeing a team that was primarily focused on that. So could you talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. So, at the Capitol Police, we had a pretty small intel team. When I started there were 11 analysts under me. And predominantly, our job was looking into threats made against members of Congress. And during my time there, we looked into probably about 20,000 threats, maybe a little bit more. In 2021, that was the highest recorded number of threats in a year. And both sides of the aisle were threatened equally. And so we spent a lot of time investigating threats because a lot of the threats were made online. So we had to dig in to try to figure out who made those threats, prepare a package, and then that is given over to the agents who would do subpoenas and, the legal process part of it, work with the U.S. Attorney's Office to press charges if that was warranted. So that was the bulk of our time. But we also looked at, bigger threats. We also monitored protest activity, and not to infringe on anyone's First Amendment rights. We definitely protected those regardless of who was protesting there. And we've had white supremacists, we've had all sorts of unsavory characters in the Capitol, but they have the right to demonstrate just like anyone else. And we were very protective of that right. But we did want to make sure that there weren't people who were going to be violent at those protests. Make sure the two groups, the protesters and the counter protesters, stayed apart to not cause trouble. They can both protest, just do it peacefully. So we did a lot of that. And then leading up to January 6th, to address your second question, there were 3 MAGA marches, January 6th being the last one. There was one on November 14th, there was one on December 12th, and then another one on January 6th. And so what I think distinguished January 6th from the previous two is that, in November, not all the states had declared a winner yet at that point. So there was still a lot of hope that things could go a different way. And then in December, there were a lot of lawsuits still pending. And so again, I think, protesters and supporters of the current president now were hopeful that he could, prevail in the courts. And then when January 6th came, to me, the only target could have been Congress, because they were there to certify the votes. And so stopping the certification of the electoral votes was, I think, the only action that they felt like they could take at that point. And so that's what I think was, different. we didn't know, like January 6th is in the Constitution. That's when, that's when the certification is going to take place. We didn't know that it was going to necessarily become violent or a riot until probably mid to late December, because a rally on January 6th was not even contemplated until after the MAGA 2 rally in December. So it wasn't until like December 16th, 17th, 18th that we started to hear that there was going to be a rally, number one. And we didn't see intelligence showing that it was going to be violent until even later in the month. And then you're bumping against holidays too. And so, like, it was, we had multiple iterations of the intelligence report. The first one didn't mention violence at all because I think that first report was issued on December 16th, and there wasn't any intelligence saying that it was going to be violent in that first report. And then subsequent reports, we saw more and more that it was going to be violent.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I liked about your book is you go into some detail on how you developed that intelligence and how you collected it. And then, so talk a little bit about that process, and then we'll talk about who these people were.
Yeah, so the intelligence collection, in Intel speak, it's called open source intelligence. And that's essentially just intelligence that is not classified. So it's stuff you can find online. And what we were seeing before January 6th is that most of the planning was happening, right there, like in front of us. Parler at the time was the social media platform that was being used prominently by a lot of these right-wing extremist groups. So there was a lot of planning there, but to a lesser degree, we saw, Facebook. I'm trying to think of Telegram wasn't quite as big as it is now. Really, Parler was the one where there was a lot of activity there. And we could see planning, we could see people coordinating that they were going to be there. We could see people talking about bringing weapons, talking about being violent. And so really it was just a matter of like knowing where extremists hung out on the internet and looking at what they were saying and reading and seeing what their plans were. There's also, there was coordination with other law enforcement entities, particularly the DC Police, the Metropolitan Police Department, MPD. And we did meet with them regularly. FBI, DHS, some of the other entities and members of the intelligence community were on those calls with us. I will say FBI and DHS were not, they didn't bring a lot to the table when it came to sharing information, which was unfortunate because it left me in a position where I'm like, things are going to be really bad. And I didn't really have anyone else in the intelligence community like backing me up and being like, oh yeah, we're seeing the same thing. Like it was just me. So that was problematic because I would like to think that if the FBI had come in and said, hey, we're seeing this too, it would have given credence to what I was telling them and it would have been taken more seriously.
Yeah, and I want to return to that story in a minute. But first, let's get back to the who these right-wing extremists are. They're now all free again, and so they're out and about. But people probably now familiar with Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, but at the time, they were still somewhat. I wouldn't call them fringe, but they were not mainstream actors, correct?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people did know, or at least had heard of the Proud Boys just based on the presidential debate where they got a shout out. I don't think anyone knew who they were before then, but certainly they knew after. And so you had these groups. So I think it's important to note too that only about a third of the people who ended up being arrested for their activities on January 6th were formally part of an extremist group. That doesn't mean that the others didn't subscribe to the same ideology, but just as far as like identifying as part of the group, it was only about a third of them. And I'd categorize them into a few different like categories. One, you had your white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. You had your militia type groups, which is like your Oath Keepers and your three percenters. You had your conspiracy theorists, your QAnon people, and then Proud Boys was kind of in their own category. Ideologically, they were a little bit different than all the others. So you had all of those groups coming together. What I think is unique is that because ideologically they're quite different, but they all came together for a common cause. And so that was, I think, unique for January 6th. I think the other part of it is that, and I don't want to get too political here, but those groups were really brought into the fold and like empowered and given a platform to speak out and to spread their hate. And I think that's why they felt it was okay to behave like the way they did. I mean, and you can get into the psychology of like group, like mobs and things like that too. But I think they did feel like, and they were right, is that they would eventually be pardoned even if they did something illegal. And that has come to fruition.
And I think that that's a political question that isn't seems settled, but isn't settled, depending on which congressional report you read. I suppose. I guess you can have your different views, but let's talk a little bit more about, because I think it's important to understand why these people were there, what they were trying to accomplish, and beyond stopping the election. Because I think there's an underlying kind of ideology that is not talked about as much as the overt, like stop the steal kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that the answer to that question depends on, the group that you're talking to. If you were talking to like the QAnon type people, I think they would say, there's, the deep state and the Democrats are like corrupt and they have, sex trafficking rings and all sorts of like crazy stuff. And they needed to like go there to like, they needed someone, Trump, to be their leader and expose all these wrongdoings and like make the world right again. So that's like one side of things. A lot of the white supremacist neo-Nazi groups, they're what we call accelerationists, and they wanted to do something to accelerate the collapse of society so that they could rebuild it in the image that they wanted, namely a white Christian society. So you have that group. And then, you've got like, and this is where I think Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, have some overlap, is that they wanted to disrupt the government. And it has, to do with like personal freedoms and civil liberties and things like that. And that like anti-government sort of like militia type ideology. So yeah, you're right. Like they all came together to disrupt the election, but their underlying reasons was different based on the ideology that they believed.
Yeah, because that was something you drove home pretty well in the book, and is that if they had agreed on more, if they had been able to work together better, then this would have been a lot more catastrophic. But it was these differences of ideology and things that kind of saved the day, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, January 6th could have definitely been a lot worse than it was. And that's hard to say because it was bad. It was pretty bad. So, but it could have been worse.
So, okay, let's get back to um, you were one of the few, if not the only one, ringing the bell and saying this is not going to be like the other two protests that we had, as you said, November and December for the MAGA rallies. So what were you seeing? How did you communicate it? And how was that message received?
Yeah, so I was seeing a lot of talk about bringing weapons, people coming armed, people organizing. We knew like the hotels in the area were like booked up, which meant that there were a lot of people coming into the city. That morning, I checked with the people at the metro, and they said ridership was up significantly, which is notable because we were in the middle of the pandemic still. So like we knew, and I talked to people down so for people who are not in DC, just to give you some lay of the land here, you have there was there were two rallies going on at the same time, and they were right next to each other. One was at the Ellipse, which is right next to the White House, and that's where Trump spoke. And then there was one in Freedom Plaza, which is just next to the Ellipse. Those two locations are on the other side of the National Mall, and you have to walk about 2 miles to get up to the Capitol. So just to like let you know like where they were and where people were. And I had called, spoken to someone in MPD the morning of January 6th to ask like how many people were there. And two things were notable. One, they said there were about 25,000 people there at the time that I called. And two, he said that there were a lot of backpacks being left outside of the screening area for the Ellipse. It's just like when any president speaks, people are screened, they have to go through security. If people were leaving backpacks before they went through security, like that was a sign that they had something in their backpacks that wouldn't get through security. So to me, and I communicated that up to, my supervisors at the Capitol Police, along with all the intelligence that I heard beforehand, and put it in the report. So backing up a little bit, so we did our final iteration of our intelligence report the Sunday before January 6th. January 6th was on a Wednesday. I sent up this intelligence report Sunday night. And my supervisor, Chief Gallagher, he was the deputy chief of intelligence and investigations. He received it and he sent it up to his boss, who was Chief Pittman. She was the number 2 person. And we know that he also sent it to Chief Sund, who is the chief of police for the Capitol Police. And Chief Sund acknowledged receipt. Like I have the email, I put the email out on social media because he likes to say that he didn't get the intelligence. Like, no, here's the email with you acknowledging receipt of it. So it was communicated. The next day on Monday, we had a briefing. Chief Sund did not attend the briefing. He did not ask any questions. If he had questions, he didn't ask for a back brief. There weren't a lot of questions. The briefing on that Monday was for lieutenants and above, so more like the leadership within the Capitol Police. And the way it was supposed to work was that I send up the intelligence report. It got sent down to all the supervisors in the Capitol Police, and they would brief it out at roll call. Because these are police officers, they're not sitting at desks, they're not just like looking at emails. They also did not have any work phones at the time, like cell phones. So that was something that was instituted after January 6th. So they didn't really have any means to get information and get intelligence unless their supervisor briefed it out at roll call. And some units did get the briefing and did get the intelligence, but most of them did not. So they were not necessarily aware of what was going to happen, what was coming.
Yeah, that was very frustrating to read about in your book. That like knowing what happens and knowing how it could have. But there were successes on the day of. They stopped a couple vans with at least one van with weapons and Molotov cocktails and things like that. So again, there were some. The police were on the scene and doing things, but it wasn't quite as briefed as it could have been, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were hit and misses. Yeah, sure. I think you're talking about Mr. Kaufman, who had coolers of explosives in his truck, and he drove up from Alabama and had all sorts of weapons. But we also had, the Russian national who was like taking pictures and like was lying about why he was there, and like the Capitol Police kind of didn't do anything about that. And I was like, no, this is a big deal. So yeah, I mean, I think they were overwhelmed. I think they were unprepared and unprepared in a lot of ways. They didn't have their equipment that day. I think they probably needed better training on how to deal with those things. Because you have to understand the Capitol Police deals with protests literally every single day. There is someone protesting about something all the time. Like we had people bring horses once, like randomly to protest, killing of wild horses. We've had protests about Britney Spears, like everything runs the gamut from, something silly like the two that I just listed all the way to like, abortion rights and things like that, more serious topics. So I think there was a sense of like almost arrogance with them. Like, we do this every day. We know how to do it. This is like our bread and butter, and we don't need help and in that sort of like sentiment, when really like they did, and this was different, and this was going to be different, and they weren't prepared.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that kind of machismo attitude of the Capitol Police, because that's something you faced as a non-police officer and a woman within the organization. And if you're comfortable talking about that briefly, that would be fantastic. Your experience working within that organization.
Yeah, and like you know, obviously I'm a woman, and law enforcement and intelligence are very like male dominated like areas. And so, men, I think, generally start at like a place of credibility. Like, they have credibility. They can do things to lose that credibility, but they start as being seen as credible. Women start as being not credible. And so you have to work like twice as hard to have to make it to the man's starting line when it comes to credibility. And I was also brand new at the Capitol Police. Like I said, I hadn't even been there 3 months. So people didn't really know who I was and didn't know what I could do, what I was capable of. And so I think that contributed to people not listening to me and not taking me seriously. And someone just asked me recently, do you think being a woman was the reason why people didn't listen to you? And I said, I don't know if that was necessarily the reason in the beginning. I mean, there might be some of like that, what's it called? Implicit bias there. But I think, after January 6th, because I was a woman, they thought that they could pin all the failures of the Capitol Police on me and that I would not speak up. But here we are having this conversation. So clearly I did. But I think that was an underestimation particularly on Chief Sun's part.
Yeah, and I want to get to the finger pointing in a minute, but let's talk about what happens when the rioters get to the Capitol and what the forced deployment was and kind of what happened, what your job was as soon as that started to go down.
Yeah. So the beginning, I'll back up a little bit. So the beginning of that day, like, I get in the morning, and it was funny, and I put this in the book too, because we had seen intelligence saying that the Proud Boys were not going to wear their normal like black and gold colors. But I'm walking in my office, and there's like a big group of them like walking down the sidewalk right across the street from my office. I was like, well, I guess they didn't get the memo because they were all in their like full garb. So it was busy from the get-go. And then we had protests, I think, at McConnell's house that morning too. So when I got in, I was like dealing with that. And then, activity started to pick up at the Ellipse and at Freedom Plaza. So we were monitoring that all morning. So getting to like when people started marching up, like I said, it's a couple miles away. And so we saw them on camera, like we knew they were coming. The problem with what the Capitol Police did was that they had positioned more officers on the east side of the Capitol, which is over by the Supreme Court. And the reason why they did that was because the MAGA 1 and MAGA 2 marches, the protesters came up for the MAGA 1, they started in Freedom Plaza and then went and had like a rally in front of the Supreme Court, and they had speakers, like members of Congress and stuff spoke there. For the MAGA 2 one, they started at the Supreme Court and then went down to Freedom Plaza. So the Capitol Police had positioned more officers on the east side, but that kind of didn't make a whole lot of sense because people are coming up from the National Mall, which is on the west side of the Capitol. And that's where the first breach happened. And if you look at the videos, like, there are very few officers there compared to the number of people. And they also had for their barriers just like bike racks. Like, I can pick up a bike rack. Like, bike racks are there to like corral people, but it's not there to like stop people from coming through. And they had removed barriers the night before too, which, I mean, there's a lot to be said there for that. So, the police were very, very quickly overwhelmed. And I think that contributed to it because not only did they not have the intelligence, but they weren't positioned well. They didn't have enough officers there, and they were just overwhelmed very quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, watching the video, it seemed like there were 6 or 7 police officers on the entire stairs. I know there were more, but it seemed very few, and that
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed very quickly too. And then, yeah, I can't even imagine being overtaken by that, and then trying to figure out what to do next. So we know what happened as far as they get inside. There,
Mm-hmm.
there's the shot that's fired that kills Ashley Babbitt. And then they kind of retreat at that point because I don't know. It seemed like that was kind of, oh, this is too real kind of thing. And then um, everyone goes home. One of the questions that I've heard over and over again is, and it's not addressed in your book, but maybe you have some insight into it, is why weren't more people arrested at as they were leaving at the event itself? Why were people allowed to leave?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think it's a valid criticism. I think initially, and I will just say, Ashley Babbitt was shot, um, but people really didn't start leaving the Capitol until I think the Virginia State Police were the first ones who like came. And just to back up a little bit, the riot started around 1:30 in the afternoon, and there were calls made to other police departments to come in and help, which I will just say that there was a lot of talk about the National Guard and why weren't they there and all that. Like we can debate that all day long, but at the end of the day, the Capitol Police had mutual aid agreements with all the police departments in the area, and they could have had them come even if the National Guard wasn't authorized. They could have leveraged all those other police departments, and they didn't. They didn't call them until like the riot was already happening. And so like that was a call they should have made like the day before, but they didn't. So people didn't leave until some of these other police departments really came in and the manpower was present at the Capitol. So, to answer your question about like why weren't more people arrested, I think initially it was just because they thought that if they started to arrest people, one, they were already overwhelmed, like numbers wise, and two, they didn't want to instigate the rioters further. And a lot of them were armed. And actually, it's a funny story. It's not funny, but it is funny. Come the spring, we had the Capitol landscapers coming and like raking leaves and stuff, and they were finding like weapons in the leaves left over from January 6th. So there was a lot of weapons there, and I think that was part of the reason why people weren't arrested on the spot, just because like it could have made a bad situation even worse.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So, January 7th, you all come to work. What
Mm-hmm.
happens? What's the first thing that happens on January 7th when you get to work?
Yeah, January 7th. So I didn't go home on the 6th until like very late that night. And then I came in very, very early the next morning. Actually, it was a very like somber feeling in the office. I think everyone was kind of shocked about what happened the day before, but also one of the officers had died, or he hadn't died at that point in the morning, but he was on life support, and there was discussion that he was probably going to be taken off of life support. So we knew his like death was imminent, and so there were a lot of like people crying in the office, and just very upset in the office. Um, for my team and what we were doing with intelligence wise is we were reviewing all the videos, and we had the day before we had like as the videos were being live streamed, we saved all of those and we put them all in a folder. And the next day we went through and we were looking for people who, committed unlawful acts. And then we were working. So January 7th, too, we had the FBI in the office along with a lot of our agents at the Capitol Police. And they were putting together a task force to pursue those people who had done, all the illegal things that we saw them do. So that was really like when things started, and that's what my team did. So between, dealing with just the general aftermath and the general feeling, and then there was an investigation going on about a million things, like the shooting of Ashley Babbitt, why, it happened in the first place, and Congress is upset. The chief of police gets fired, like on television, and so it was just an overwhelming day.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then in the book, you kind of lead into the finger pointing started almost immediately. And who was going to take not so much the fall for this, but where were the problems that led to this ultimately happening? And as you said before, a lot fell on your shoulders. So can you explain how that happened and what that was like to be kind of the weight, the water carrier for some of this stuff?
Yeah, like, I mean, maybe I was just naive, but I was kind of shocked when it started, like people saying, like, well, it was an intelligence failure. And I was like, no, it wasn't. Like, I gave you the report. I told you what it was. And then those accusations kept getting louder. And it was pretty shocking to me, because I knew, like, I'm just one person who just wants to go into the office, do her job, and like go home to her kids. Like, that's it. Like, that's all I want to do. Like, I don't want to be thrust into the middle of this. I didn't want to be there on January 6th. I didn't want to be part of this story. I didn't want to have to write this book. Like, I just didn't want any of it. But as like, and then, this goes back to one of the questions you asked before. Like, my team was a struggling team. Like, when I got there, like, the Intel analysts had not had any formal training. They really just weren't very good at their job, and it wasn't completely their fault. They just weren't ever trained well. And so I was trying to, like, before January 6th and continuing after January 6th, like, put some performance expectations, get them training, get them in line, and get them to be up to speed where they needed to be and in line with other intelligence analysts in the federal government. And understandably, not all of them loved me for that. No one likes a supervisor when they do like supervisory things. And so that kind of like, they kind of like piled onto that as well. When they saw the opportunity that, oh, I was going to be the fall girl for all of this January 6th stuff. Like, they were like, well, we had all this intelligence and she didn't do anything with it. And I was like, well, no, I did. You might not have been there when I briefed it out because you weren't at the briefing, but I certainly provided that information to the people who needed to have that information. But on the other side too, they were also saying like, well, she was giving us other duties and we had never been trained in collecting intelligence. Like, well, what was it? Did you not know how to collect intelligence, or did you? And you gave it to me and I ignored it. Like, pick which side you want. But it was like really hard, really, really hard. And the Capitol Police is like a very closed organization, on multiple levels. Like, they're not subject to Freedom of Information Act, but also people who had been there for a very long time. They're very closed. And I talk about some of that in the book. And the people very quickly after January 6th, like, align themselves, with this person or with that person. And that made getting to like the truth and what happened a lot more challenging, because all of the things that happened on January 6th were being discussed through a lens of like what side you were on. And that, is really unfortunate.
Yeah, and you do point to leadership failure as well, and kind of what Stephen Sund was, what he did the day of or didn't do the day of that really was more determinant than your intelligence finding efforts. So could you talk a little bit about what he was up to that day and what you what could have gone differently, I suppose?
Yeah. So Sund, So, like I said before, he had some of the barriers removed the night before, which was problematic. He also, back to the National Guard, he never made a formal request for the National Guard. So, and because there was never a request in writing, we will perpetually have, until the end of time, this question about like, was it requested? Was it rejected for political optics? Like, we don't know because it's just a he said, she said kind of deal because there was never any formal request. But we can say objectively and factually that there was no formal request for the National Guard. And to be honest, like there never was going to be a formal request because the National Guard did not come to the Capitol. And, regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats were in power, no one on either side of the aisle would authorize the National Guard to be there because they did not like the optics of like a military entity guarding the Capitol. National Guard was last at the Capitol before January 6th on September 11th. So they weren't coming. And, Sand, and I talk about this in the book, like I said, he didn't call other police departments until things were bad and the riot was well underway. And we knew they were coming. I told him how many people were down at the National on the National Mall and the Ellipse and Freedom Plaza. I told him about the backpacks and things like that. And at one point, and I relay this in the book, he kind of just gave up and he went into his office. And that was when the DC mayor stepped in and sent someone from MPD to the Capitol Police to essentially like regain control of the Capitol. And he did. I understand he had some very, very choice words for Sun when he got there. And there was a little bit of a shouting match, as there probably should have been at that point. Because that's like, a plane like crashing and the pilot being like, I'm just going to take a break. Like, you can't do that. Like, no, like, this is crisis moment. Like, you need a leader to rise up. And Sund was not that leader.
Right. And let's talk about you testified in front of both J6 committees, the Democrat one and the shadow one. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Let's, I've always said one of my life goals is to testify before a Senate subcommittee. Is it something I should really be looking forward to doing?
No. I think you can have other aspirations. That's not what you want to be doing. Yeah, it's not like, so, I testified with the January 6th committee twice, actually. And then once with the Republican shadow committee. And then more recently, Representative Loudermilk has also been investigating January 6th. So, the two January, like the actual January 6th subcommittee, the special committee, I went voluntarily with the shadow committee. They didn't seem particularly inclined to acknowledge like what really happened. Like they went in there, and if you read their report, like a good chunk of their report is about threat assessments that we do that had nothing to do with January 6th. And so when Loudermilk called me to testify, I was like, no, you need to subpoena me. And I want to see like the parameters of this interview. And I was not so keen to cooperate at that point. But I had a really good attorney, and he was there with me the whole time. So that was really helpful to have someone who's been through this before and been through this with like high profile cases like next to me. Although that poor man, like I put him through a lot. Like, do I have to answer these questions? Yes, you do have to answer the question. So, yeah.
Do you think your role in this or your participation in the law enforcement side of this has been vindicated, or do you feel like your story is still somewhat tainted by others' views of what happened that day?
No, I think I have been like, I think the truth is out there, and I think the people who want to know the truth know that I am being honest. Um, but there's always going to be people out there who don't like me or don't like anyone associated with January 6th for one reason or another. And that's fine because those people are not big on truth in like many aspects of the world, not just as it pertains to me. But I do feel good that I did speak out and that I did tell my story. Because if I didn't, like the only record of what happened that day and what happened with the intelligence would have been those people who were talking just to like to discount their own culpability.
And it seems like there's a lot of that going on with
Mm-hmm.
the January 6th. So obviously things on the political landscape have changed, and the massive prosecution of the January 6th rioters has come to conclusion, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
with the pardons of them all. So it's kind of hard to ask this question, but how do we stop, from a law enforcement point of view, this from happening again? And in the book, there's some recommendations that you make, but I don't know where we are today with some of those.
Yeah, it's like it's a complex question, a complex answer. You know, I'm worried about where we are as a country right now. Um, I'm very worried, and I'm worried that it's okay to hate now. Um, and like hate never solves a problem. Like it has never in the history of the world solved a problem. So like it doesn't benefit a society. And so to encourage people to be hateful, to make it okay to hate is like it's bad. It's really bad for our country. It's bad for the world. So that's problematic. Um, I think we need to like rebuild as a country and we need to have strong leadership, regardless of whether it's Republican or Democrat. Like we need to have strong leadership. And I think politicians generally, there's a whole like I think there's a lot of complicating factors in why we are in this political situation where we are. And like right-wing extremism, that is something that had been brewing for a number of years before it hit the United States, like elsewhere in the world, like particularly Europe and South America. So it was kind of inevitable that it was going to end up in the United States as well. But I think, we as a country, like our political system, and I'm not saying like, let's not have democracy. I'm not saying that at all. But, the way our political system is structured, it encourages a lot of like to win as a politician. I've run for office, local office myself. Like to win, you need huge amounts of money, huge amounts of money. And so I think there's a case to be made for campaign finance reform as a means to get more like regular people running for office because we don't have regular people running for office. And when you don't have regular people running for office, they forget who the regular people are that they're being elected to represent. And like it comes down to, and I think, one of the things Trump did very successfully was that he talked to like the common person and he talked about things that people cared about, like prices of eggs and things like that. And the Dems did not do that. They were talking about like macro level, more theoretical stuff. And like that's hard for people to relate to. And so like we need to get back to the basics and we need more politicians who truly care about the people they're representing. And it's hard to do that when you spend all your time like trying to get money. And that's how our political game is played now. It's just money, 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 money. And then we forget.
Yeah, I was shocked to find out that the majority of the time for a representative or congressperson is spent fundraising, even during the day. So it's like they have a special place they go and fundraise all day long and not legislating and all that kind of stuff. So,
and it's true. I mean, like when I was like at the Capitol, like I saw their schedules and they like do fundraise, like they really do spend the majority of their time fundraising.
Yeah, and I don't think that's something most people understand or realize. I didn't until I saw that. I think it was on Frontline or something.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to touch on one thing, which I think is the spread of right-wing extremism and what you found in online spaces
Mhm.
and what we've now seen with content moderation being taken to new and misinformation and this kind of thing. What can we as citizens or people engaging in these with people like this in our lives and in our communities, what's what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think it's disappointing, like the lack of like fact checking and things like that. Like, sure, it makes it like easier to communicate on online because you don't have to worry about like going into like Facebook jail anymore, things like that. But it's a larger issue with social media because social media you're talking into like this echo chamber. And if there's someone there who questions you or disagrees with you, like you can silence them with the click of a button. Like you don't need to have them talking to you anymore. So you're not being challenged and your thoughts aren't being challenged. You're only talking to people who are reiterating your thoughts. And when you have thoughts that are not correct, like we saw before January 6th, like we see now, like it's just like people can get whipped up into a frenzy on like misinformation, disinformation. I also think, and to your question too, of like what we need to do, I don't think the average American realizes how much foreign influence there is in the United States, particularly on social media platforms. Like, a lot of these countries, particularly Russia, they're very good at playing the long game. And you have bots and you have trolls. Bots are like programs that will spit out like a response based on like keywords and things like that. Trolls are actual people who will engage with you. And they may have social media accounts that are years old and they are there to sow division within the United States. And because when we're divided, we're weak, and our adversaries know that. And they use that to their advantage. And they have had a whole lot of success. And look at where we are now. So I think like social media companies, if they don't want to moderate like misinformation and disinformation, they need to really look at, who's using their platforms and why are they using it. Like everyone wants to be connected to, the people you graduated high school with or whatever it may be, and your friends through social media. But some of those conversations are being driven by people who don't have like those innocent social connections in mind.
Thank you for that, because I think that one of the things that I've discovered is that this white um, supremacy and neo-Nazism is international, and it isn't just a group of guys in Virginia. It's also a group of guys in Eastern Europe and other places who are communicating, and it's always been that way. It's never been a non-international movement, and the coordination seems to be getting more tightened, I suppose.
Yeah, and I would say, like a lot of the tactics that originated elsewhere are being adopted by the extremists here. And you look at like white supremacist groups like the active clubs, they're modeled after European active clubs. And like here, I'm in Arlington, Virginia. We had the founder of the base, which was a white supremacist group here in Virginia, and now he's fled maybe to Russia, the leader of that group. And so there is a lot of overlap, and they are taking inspiration. What I think is different now is that rather than just being consumers of extremism here in the United States, we're like outsourcing that. People are looking to us now at like how are extremists behaving and like what can we replicate for our own hate in our own country. And that's a switch that I don't think we've seen in a very, very long time here in the US.